The clock struck midnight, and the silence in Henry Caldwell's small, weathered house was louder than any birthday cheer he'd ever known. At 97, he sat alone in his creaking rocking chair, the flicker of a single candle casting shadows on the walls, each one a ghost of a memory he could no longer grasp. His wife, Eleanor, gone 3 years now, had always made his birthdays a quiet symphony of lovers' soft humming, a homemade cake, and a kiss that felt like home. Now, the cake was store-bought, half-eaten, and stale on the kitchen counter. The radio, his only companion, crackled with static, playing a song he didn't recognize. Henry's hands trembled as he adjusted his glasses, staring at the empty chair across from him where Eleanor used to sit, her laughter filling the room like sunlight. He whispered her name, half expecting an answer, but the silence only deepened. Another year older, another year alone. He closed his eyes, letting the weight of solitude press against his chest, heavier than the years themselves. The morning sun barely pierced the fog that clung to the rolling hills of Willow Creek, the small town Henry had called home for nearly a century. He shuffled to the porch, his cane tapping a slow rhythm on the warped floorboards. The air smelled of damp earth and impending rain, a scent that reminded him of the days he and Eleanor would walk hand in hand through the fields, dreaming of a future they'd never fully live. He settled into the porch swing, its chains groaning under his frail weight, and sipped weak coffee from a chipped mug. The world felt still, too still, as if it were holding its breath. Then came the noisy low hum, like a swarm of bees, growing louder. Henry squinted, his eyes straining against the morning haze. Headlights pierced the fog, one after another, until a convoy of vans and cars clogged the narrow dirt road leading to his house. Doors slammed, voices shouted, and figures spilled out, hauling cameras and microphones. TV crews, reporters in crisp suits and eager faces swarmed his front yard, their equipment glinting like weapons in the pale light. Henry froze, his coffee mug trembling in his hands. What could they want with an old man like him? Mr. Caldwell. Henry Caldwell. A young reporter called, her voice sharp and urgent. She pushed through the crowd, a microphone thrust forward like a sword. Can you confirm the story? Did you really do it? Her eyes gleamed with the hunger of someone chasing a scoop, her words a jumble of accusation and awe. Henry's heart thudded, a rare surge of adrenaline in his tired veins. Do what? He croaked, his voice barely audible over the clamor. He gripped his cane tighter, the world spinning slightly. He hadn't spoken to anyone outside the grocery clerk in months, let alone a mob of strangers. The reporter's question hung in the air, unanswered, as more voices joined the fray, shouting questions he couldn't parse. The letter. The war. How did you keep it secret? A letter? A war? Henry's mind raced, grasping for meaning. He'd lived through World War II, sure, but that was decades ago. His service as a radio operator in the Pacific, a chapter he rarely spoke of, buried under the weight of time. He shook his head, bewildered, as the crowd pressed closer. A man in a baseball cap, wielding a camera, tripped over the garden hose Eleanor had once used to water her roses. The sight of ether roses, now wilted and wild, stung more than the chaos unfolding before him. Just then, a new figure emerged from the crowd, parting the reporters like a ship cutting through waves. She was older, perhaps in her 60s, with silver hair pulled into a neat bun and eyes that carried a quiet intensity. She wore a simple blue coat and carried a leather satchel slung over her shoulder. Unlike the others, she didn't shout or shove. She stepped onto the porch, her gaze locking onto Henry's. Mr. Caldwell, she said softly, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. My name is Clara. I'm not with them. I need to talk to you alone. Henry blinked, his suspicion warring with curiosity. There was something familiar in her eyes, a spark that reminded him of Eleanor's quiet strength. He nodded, gesturing to the door. Inside, he muttered, his voice steadier now. The reporters protested, their voices rising, but Clara turned and raised a hand, silencing them with a look that brooked no argument. She followed Henry into the house, the door shutting out the chaos. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood and memories. Henry sank into his rocking chair, his hands still trembling. Clara sat across from him, in Eleanor's chair, and for a moment, he wanted to ask her to move. But her expression, earnest, almost pleading, stopped him. She opened her satchel and pulled out a yellowed envelope, its edges frayed and stained with time. "This," she said, holding it up, "is why they're here. It's why I'm here." Henry stared at the envelope, his breath catching. His name was scrawled across it in a handwriting he hadn't seen in decades. Eleanor's. His heart lurched, a painful jolt of longing and confusion. "Where did you get that?" he whispered, his voice breaking. Clara leaned forward, her voice low and steady. "It was found in a museum archive, hidden in a box of war artifacts. It's a letter you wrote, Henry, during the war. A letter that was never sent." She paused, her eyes searching his. "It tells a story the world needs to hear. A story about you and what you did." Henry's mind reeled. He'd written countless letters during the war, most of them to Eleanor, but they were mundane, filled with love and longing, not secrets. What could this letter say? What had he done that could draw a circus of reporters to his doorstep? He reached for the envelope, his fingers brushing the paper, and for the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of a life he thought he'd left behind. Clara's voice softened further, almost a whisper. "You don't remember, do you?" "Not yet, but you will." She slid the envelope across the table, her eyes never leaving his. "Read it, Henry. It's time." Henry's fingers trembled as he held the envelope, its weight heavier than any letter should be. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in as Eleanor's handwriting stared back at him, a ghost from a life he'd buried. He hadn't written a letter like this, not one that could spark a frenzy outside his door. Clara sat patiently, her hands folded, her gaze steady but kind. "It's not just a letter, Henry," she said. "It's a confession, a piece of history." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning Henry couldn't yet grasp. He slid a finger under the flap, the paper tearing with a sound that echoed like a gunshot in his quiet house. Inside was a single sheet, yellowed and brittle, covered in his own cramped handwriting from a lifetime ago. He began to read, his voice barely a whisper. "My dearest Eleanor, if you're reading this, I've failed you. I've carried this weight too long, and I can't bear it alone anymore." The words blurred as his eyes stung, not from age but from the sudden rush of memory. The Pacific, 1944. The hum of the radio in the cramped, sweltering tent. The crackle of coded messages. And the choice he'd made, one he'd locked away, even from himself. The letter spoke of a night when Henry, a young radio operator, intercepted a Japanese transmission pinpointing an Allied supply convoy. Protocol demanded he reported immediately, but the frequency was jammed, the lines dead. He'd acted alone, rerouting the signal to a nearby destroyer. Knowing it could cost lives, American or enemy, he couldn't be sure. The convoy was saved, but the destroyer, caught in the crossfire, sank. 32 men lost. Henry had never spoken of it, not to Eleanor, not to anyone. He'd buried the guilt, convinced it was his alone to carry. "Why now?" Henry asked, his voice hoarse. "Why after all these years?" Clara leaned forward, her eyes softening. The letter surfaced in a museum's war archive, part of a donation from a collector. It was traced back to you. Historians called it a missing piece, a decision that altered the war's Pacific theater. The media caught wind, and now they're calling you a hero. Or a traitor. Depends on who's talking. Henry's heart sank. A hero? A traitor? He'd been neither, just a scared kid making a call in the dark. He looked at Clara, searching her face for answers. "Why do you care? You're not a reporter." She hesitated, then reached into her satchel again, pulling out a faded photograph. It showed a young sailor, grinning, with Clara's eyes. "This is my father," she said. "He was on that convoy you saved. Without you, I wouldn't be here." Her voice cracked, and for the first time, Henry saw the weight she carried, to a debt she'd come to repay. The revelation hit him like a wave. He'd never known the names of the men on that convoy, never allowed himself to think of them as real, as fathers, as lives. He stared at the photograph, the sailor's smile a mirror of Clara's. "I didn't save them," he muttered. "I got lucky, and others died." Clara shook her head. "You made a choice. That's what matters. The world wants to know why you kept it secret." Henry didn't have an answer. He'd hidden the letter because it was too heavy, too raw. He'd wanted to protect Eleanor from the man he feared he'd become. Now, the world was tearing open that wound, and he wasn't sure he could face it. A knock at the door broke the silence. Clara stood, her expression shifting to one of quiet resolve. "They won't wait forever," she said. But you don't have to face them alone. She opened the door, revealing not a reporter, but a young man in his 30s, his face nervous but determined. He carried a notebook, its pages dog-eared and worn. "This is Daniel," Clara said. "He's a historian, not a journalist. He's been studying your letter for months. He thinks there's more to your story, something even the letter doesn't say." Daniel stepped forward, his voice gentle. "Mr. Caldwell, I believe you intercepted more than one transmission that night. There's evidence of a second signal, one that could have changed the outcome of the battle entirely. But it's missing from the records. Did you destroy it?" Henry's breath caught. A second signal. The memory flickered, faint but sharp, a burst of static, a coded message he couldn't decipher, a moment of panic. He'd buried it, like the letter, like the guilt. "I don't know," he said, his voice shaking. "I don't remember." Daniel's eyes lit up, not with accusation, but with curiosity. "If we can find out, it could rewrite history. Not just yours, but the war's." He paused, glancing at Clara. "And it might give you peace." Henry looked between them. Clara, the daughter of a man he'd saved, and Daniel, a stranger chasing truth. Outside, the reporters' voices droned on, a storm he couldn't escape. But inside, something Storita needed to know, to remember, to face the past he'd run from for decades. "Help me," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Help me remember." Henry sat at his kitchen table, the letter spread before him like a map to a place he'd forgotten. Clara and Daniel flanked him, their presence both a comfort and a pressure. The weight of their expectations pressed against his chest, mingling with the ache of Eleanor's absence. He traced the words he'd written decades ago, each one a shard of a memory he'd tried to bury. The second signal, Daniel mentioned it, was there, lurking in the fog of his mind, but every time he reached for it, it slipped away. "Let's start small," Daniel said, his notebook open, pen poised. "Tell me about that night. Anything you remember." His voice was gentle, but there was an urgency beneath it, a historian's hunger for truth. Clara, quieter, poured Henry a fresh cup of coffee, her movements deliberate, as if she sensed the fragility of the moment. Henry closed his eyes, letting the years peel back. The Pacific, 1944. The tent was stifling, the air thick with sweat and cigarette smoke. He was 22, hunched over a radio, headphones clamped to his ears. The first transmission had come through, clearly a Japanese plan to ambush the convoy. He'd acted fast, rerouting the signal, saving the ships. But the second signal, it was garbled, fragmented, a code he couldn't break. He'd scribbled it down, his hands shaking, knowing it was important, but not why. Then the lines went dead, and he'd made a choice to let it go, to focus on the lives he could save. "I didn't destroy it," Henry said suddenly, his voice startling even himself. "The second signal. I wrote it down, but I didn't know what it meant. I hid it." His eyes widened as the memory sharpened. "In my journal, the one I kept during the war." Clara's breath caught. "Do you still have it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry nodded slowly, his heart racing. "Upstairs. In the attic. I haven't touched it in years." He pushed himself up, his cane wobbling under his weight. Clara and Daniel followed, their footsteps echoing in the quiet house. The attic stairs creaked under their weight, each step a journey back through time. The air up there was thick with dust, the smell of old paper and forgotten things. Boxes lined the walls, filled with Eleanor's clothes, their children's toys, a life packed away. Henry pointed to a small, battered trunk in the corner. "There," he said, his voice trembling. Daniel opened it, revealing a stack of journals, their leather covers cracked with age. He handed one to Henry, its weight familiar yet foreign. Henry opened it, the pages brittle under his fingers. There, tucked between two entries, was a folded sheet of paper covered in his hurried scrawl numbers, letters, a code he'd never deciphered. Daniel's eyes lit up as he took the paper, his fingers tracing the faded ink. "This is it," he whispered. "This could be the key. A second signal, potentially a counterorder. If the Japanese had called off the ambush, and you'd acted on the first signal," he trailed off, his mind racing. "It could mean you saved more lives than you realized, or that the destroyer's loss was unavoidable." Henry's stomach twisted. "Or it means I killed those men for nothing," he said, his voice raw. The guilt he'd carried for decades surged, sharper now, cutting through the fog of time. He sank onto an old chair, the journal slipping from his hands. Clara knelt beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "You didn't know," she said. "You did what you thought was right. My father lived because of you. That's real, Henry. That's enough." But it wasn't enough. Not for Henry. The questions gnawed at him. Had he misread the situation? Had he acted too quickly? The letter, the signal, the where, it was all a puzzle he'd never solved, and now the world was demanding answers he wasn't sure he could give. A sudden crash downstairs broke the moment. Daniel rushed to the attic window, peering out. "They're getting restless," he said, his voice tense. "The reporters. They're trying to get closer." The faint sound of voices carried up, louder now, demanding Henry's story, his truth. Clara stood, her expression hardening. "We need to protect him," she said to Daniel. "He's not ready for this, not yet." She turned to Henry, her eyes fierce with determination. "We'll figure this out together. But we need time." Henry nodded, his mind still tangled in the past. The journal, the signal, the letter, they were pieces of a truth he'd hidden from himself. But as he looked at Clara, at the gratitude in her eyes, he felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Maybe, just maybe, he could face this. For Eleanor. For the men he'd saved. For the men he'd lost. "Let's go back downstairs," he said, his voice steadier now. "I need to know what that signal says." The kitchen table was now a war room, strewn with Henry's journal, the coded signal, and Clara's notes. Daniel hunched over the paper, his brow furrowed as he cross-referenced the numbers with a battered codebook he'd brought from his satchel. Henry watched, his hands clasped tightly, the weight of decades pressing down on him. The reporters outside had grown quieter, but their presence loomed, a storm waiting to break. "It's a partial code," Daniel said finally, his voice tinged with frustration. "A Japanese naval cipher, but it's incomplete. Without the full key, it's like half a sentence." He looked at Henry, his eyes searching. "Is there anything else you remember? Anything you didn't write down?" Henry shook his head, his mind a fog of half-remembered moments. The static in his headphones, the panic of that night, the weight of a decision made in seconds, it was all there, but the details were shadows. "I was scared," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "I didn't know what I was doing. I just acted." Clara reached across the table, her hand resting on his. "That's what heroes do," she said softly. "They act, even when they're scared." Her words were meant to comfort, but they only deepened Henry's unease. He wasn't a hero. He was just a man who'd made a choice and lived with the consequences. A sharp knock at the door startled them. Clara stood, her expression wary, but before she could move, the door swung open. A woman stepped inside, uninvited, her presence filling the room like a gust of wind. She was in her 50s, with sharp cheekbones and a journalist's badge pinned to her jacket. Her eyes locked onto Henry, ignoring Clara and Daniel. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice smooth but commanding. "I'm Laura Vance, with the National Herald. I've been following your story for weeks. We need to talk." Clara stepped forward, her voice firm. "He's not ready. You need to leave." Laura didn't flinch. "I'm not here to ambush him," she said, her gaze softening as she looked at Henry. "I'm here because I know what happened. Not just the letter, but the truth behind it." She pulled a folder from her bag, placing it on the table. "I've been digging through declassified war records. There's more to your story, Mr. Caldwell. Something even you don't know." Henry's heart pounded. Another twist, another layer to a past he thought he understood. He nodded, unable to speak, and Laura opened the folder, revealing a stack of documents stamped with faded military seals. "The destroyer that sank," she said. "The one you've carried guilt for. It wasn't your fault. The Japanese had a second ambush planned, one your signal didn't account for. The destroyer was hit because of a miscommunication on our side, not yours." Henry stared at the documents, his vision blurring. "How do you know this?" he whispered. Laura's voice softened. "I found a survivor's account, a radio operator like you. He was on that destroyer. He said your signal gave them a fighting chance. They knew the enemy was coming. Without you, it would have been a massacre." She paused, her eyes meeting his. "You saved more than the convoy, Henry. You gave those men hope." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over them. Clara's eyes glistened, and Daniel set down his pen, his expression one of quiet awe. Henry felt something shift inside him, a crack in the wall of guilt he'd built over decades. But it wasn't enough, not yet. The second signal still haunted him, its meaning locked away in a code he couldn't break. I need to know, Henry said, his voice stronger now. The second signal. What did it say? Laura exchanged a glance with Daniel, a silent agreement passing between them. We can help, she said. But it'll take time. The code is old, and the records are incomplete. We'll need to cross-reference everything: your journal, the archives, survivor accounts. Clara nodded, her resolve unwavering. We'll do it together, she said. For you, Henry. For my father. For everyone who needs to hear this story. Henry looked at them: Clara, Daniel, Laura, three strangers who'd walked into his life and refused to let him face it alone. Outside, the reporters waited, their cameras ready to capture a story he wasn't sure he could tell. But for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, he could find peace in the truth. Let's do it, he said, his voice steady. Let's find out what I did.